Well, it was a Monday morning at my house when I realized that no one had fed the dog. My wife Laurie and I, we have 4 kids. I think the national average is something like 1.9, so our family's a little bit larger than most. She and I are constantly reminded of that line from comedian Jim Gaffigan where he said, big families are like waterbed stores. They used to be everywhere, and now they're just weird. That's us, we're weird. And if by chance your family is as weird as a waterbed store, then you know that in order for everything to work like it's supposed to work in a large family, it's important for everyone to do their job. Which leads me back to my surprise on this Monday morning when no one did what I think anyone could have done. In fact, it's even crazier than that, because on this Monday morning, no one did what everybody said that they were going to do. The night before, we'd taken a little trip to the movies together, and we saw one of these movies that I guarantee you've seen before, even if you haven't seen this particular movie before. It's like the quintessential dog film, you know? The puppy grows up in the home of a mid-American family. 15, 20 minutes into the plot, he runs away, tours the country, and by minute 65, 70, somehow by the hand of God, he's made it back to his home, and everyone celebrates because Fido has returned. So we watch this movie and we get into the car to go home, and my kids are like talking about this renewed love that they have for our little dog at our house, our 15-year-old named Sky Racer. This is that guy. We nicknamed him Sky. He's 15. He's going to live there really, really soon. But on this day in the car, there was all kinds of conversation about like, oh, he's sleeping in my room tonight when we get home. Or tomorrow when I get out of school, I'm taking him for a walk. Or tomorrow morning when we wake up, I get to feed Sky. Thus, my surprise when just hours removed from the love fest, everyone left the house, and it hit me that no one fed the dog. Now, listen, I wouldn't pretend to know everything about you and your story, but if you and I are anything alike, and we're anything like most, then there's a very similar dynamic that sometimes happens between church on Sunday and the reality of life on a Monday. It's like we come in here week after week and we sing songs that encourage us. And if I do my job well, maybe you hear a message that inspires you, challenges you to follow Jesus more or better or closer than you ever have before. And perhaps you even leave sometimes with the idea, the sentiment of, this week I want to. Or sometimes we get real bold and we say, from now on, I'm going to. And then when Monday or Tuesday or a Thursday rolls around and we think about it again, we realize I didn't or I haven't, and we start to wonder if perhaps we ever will. Listen, the sense of despair that comes along with that train of thought, if you live with it long enough, and if you allow that internal voice to be loud enough, it is enough to make church and perhaps at times even a relationship with God feel like a thing of the past. But because it leads us to this perpetual state of failure. And come on, who wants to sign up for more of that? But what if I told you that perhaps the gap between the passion and the purpose you want to live with and the progress that you, like me, so often fail to make, what if it isn't as big as you think it is? Like, what if there really is a way for us to transfer all this desire for God on Sunday into our everyday life on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday? And what if the missing piece of the puzzle, what if it's not near as mystical as we think it is? What if it's way, way more practical? For the past couple of weeks, in light of our 12-year anniversary as a church, we've been in this short series titled Game Plan to talk about some of the things that we're moving towards collectively as a church, and then maybe more importantly, the things that we're moving towards individually as men and women who are people in it and parts of it. I said before, I set this whole series up around a question that I imagine, if you've been attending for a little bit, you've at least thought at some point in the past. And that question is this: what does this church want for me? Like, what does Alamo Community Church want for my life? What does it want for my family? What does it want for my future? And our answer to that question has been the launching pad for these past 3 weeks, for this 3-week conversation. In week 1, I told you, underneath the umbrella of connecting and reconnecting with God, we want you to connect with purpose. We want you to discover what God's overarching purpose is in this world, and what his purpose is, his individual purpose is in your life as a result of it. Last week, we talked about this idea of connecting with people, that growing and becoming like Jesus happens best when we invest our lives in a community of people who have a desire to want to grow and become like Jesus. So today, as we wrap this up, I want to give you this third and final part. I want to talk to you about the thing that bridges the gap between passion and progress. I want to talk to you today about connecting with a plan. Connecting with a plan. Here's our big idea. Following Jesus is more about the steps we take than the statements we make. Following Jesus is more about the steps we take towards him, moving in his direction, doing life with him, than the statements that we make for him or the promises that we make concerning him. Now, depending on the kind of church culture that you grew up in or perhaps didn't grow up in, I get it that a statement like that can seem really, really crazy. But I hope that by the time we finish today that you'll discover this to be crazy liberating. And perhaps it'll lead you to a place where you begin to make the kind of crazy progress in your relationship with God that you've been praying for and hoping for. But like me, you spend so much of your life filling the gap between passion and progress with more promises and more prayers, but you've never connected those things to a plan. Now, it sounds way too simple to be spiritual, but track along with me. If I were to ask you this morning, how many of you want to grow in your relationship with God? Or husbands and wives, how many of you want to make sure that Jesus is the center of your marriage? Or moms and dads, how many of you want to ensure that the life of your family is built on the foundation of Christ, that he's first in your life and first in your home? If I were to ask that question, I imagine the majority of us would raise a hand to say, of course I want that for my life, Kevin. If we would look around this room and collectively have this sense of awe, like, amazing, look how many people want to follow, want to go after Jesus. But if I were to follow that question with the question of, how are you going to do that? Like, what's your plan? No shame on you, but I imagine the results would be far less amazing. Because come on, making a promise to God, praying another prayer to God, it sounds way more spiritual than coming up with a plan. But just like you wouldn't expect to lose weight by simply making a promise that you're going to lose weight, just like you wouldn't expect to become debt-free by just praying a prayer that you would become debt-free, listen, we typically don't grow spiritually until we come up with a plan to do something practically. We typically don't grow spiritually without a plan to do something practically. That's why I said following Jesus is more about the steps that we take in his direction than it is about the statements that we sit in here on Sunday and we constantly make to ourselves and to God. So here's what I want to do this morning. With the time that I have left, I want to give you an outline. I want to share with you some thoughts about a way that you could come up with a step, your next step towards God. And because following Jesus is all about the steps that we take in his direction, I want to give this to you in the form of an acrostic with the word step. It's cheesy, I know, but I'm trying to make this memorable and portable for you. And while I'm at it, let me also give you one more disclaimer. As we talk about this today, we're going to view this through the lens of Jesus' interaction with some of his very first followers, some of the steps that he initiated with them, which means we're going to look at several passages of Scripture, which means if you're someone who you come to our church and you think, man, I really like it when we dig into just a chunk of Scripture, like that's cohesive and all together, I would just want you to know I do too. And we're going to get back to that week after next when we jump back into Luke. But for today, you get an acrostic, S-T-E-P. Here it is. The S in our handy dandy acrostic stands for start where you are. You start where you are. Again, we see this in Jesus' interaction with his very first disciples. So if you have a Bible or you want to pull one up on your phone or your tablet and follow along today, you can do that in Matthew. Matthew begins to talk about this as early as Matthew chapter 4. Listen to how he describes this. Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse 18, he said this: as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once, they left their nets, and they followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father, Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I love how Matthew seems to make a big deal out of the fact that when Jesus called his first followers, these men and women who took a step in his direction, these guys, they weren't worshiping in a synagogue. They weren't praying out in a field, in a meadow as the sun set. No, Matthew said, hey, listen, they were on a lake. They were casting their net into the lake because they were fishermen. It's like, well, what else are you if you're casting your net into the lake? In fact, when Matthew went on to tell his own story just a few chapters later in Matthew chapter 9, he described his own story in much the same way. Listen to what he said in Matthew 9:9. He says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew. Matthew's writing this about himself. He would say, that's me. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told them. And Matthew got up and he followed him. Any idea why Matthew was at a tax collector's booth? He was a tax collector when he took his first step in Jesus' direction. If you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see this pattern repeated over and over and over again. Men and women who encounter Jesus right where they are. There's a story in the Gospels about a woman that Jesus met at a well. She had been married 5 times and was living with a guy who she currently wasn't married to. Relationships were not going well for her. But that's where she was when she took her first step in his direction. Mark writes about a time when Jesus met a guy who had been living in a cemetery. He was demon possessed, and Jesus healed him when he took his first step in his direction. John tells the story of a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus met her as she was being manhandled by her accusers. And then she took her first step in his direction. We read the book of Acts, the story of the early church, and we see a guy named Saul that we now know is Paul. He says, hey, listen, I used to kill Christians, Jesus followers. And his story was he was on his way to do more of that when Jesus showed up, and he took his first step in that direction. Here's the point. When we think about getting serious in our relationship with God, or making sure that God is first in our family, or in our marriage, in our profession, the general idea that combats that in our mind is one day, someday, right? I'm gonna do that one day, someday, when I have my stuff a little bit more together than I do today. Because today I feel too, and then we all fill in the blank. I feel too inconsistent. Today I just feel too embarrassed that I'm not further along in this journey than I am. Today I'm too ashamed of the places I've been. But if Jesus showed us anything, he showed us that our journey, our next step towards him always begins as we are right where we are. And so as you and I contemplate where it is we would like to be, listen, the best place to start is right here, right now. Even if here is not the place you want it to be. Even if here is a place that you thought you would be beyond at this point in your life. So you want to take a step in his direction? Start where you are. Here's the key. But don't stay where you are. That sets us up for the T in our acrostic. T stands for take intentional action. Take intentional action. If that's too complicated, here it is. Do something. In each of these stories that I just mentioned to you, we see guys and girls who weren't content with just having an encounter with Jesus. It wasn't that they had met him and then thought, oh, that's awesome. How about I come back and do this again sometime? No, they met him and they took intentional action as a response to their encounter. You think about it in the life of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Matthew said they left the boat and their father and followed him. Matthew said much the same about his response to Jesus' invitation. He got up and followed him. It was intentional action, but it wasn't just action. It wasn't just doing something for the sake of doing something. It was doing something. It was action at the response of Jesus' invitation. In fact, when we think about that first part, the story of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, when Luke tells their story, Luke describes it a little bit differently. Luke said they'd been fishing all night and they hadn't caught anything, and Jesus shows up and he says, hey, put down your net in deep water, let down your nets for a catch. And they look on the shore and think, Rabbi. I mean, they were professional fishermen, right? It's like we hadn't caught anything all night. The only thing we're gonna catch during the day is a sunburn. Actually, here's what they said. They said, Master, we worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. Listen, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. Because you say so. They took intentional action. And the result, what happened next, was so unbelievable. Jesus said, hey, come follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. They didn't know what that meant. They were thinking like, what, are we gonna flay them, put them on ice, sell them for $16 a pound? I don't know, what are you talking about? But listen, they left the boats and the business and they began to follow Jesus as a response to what they heard him say, what they saw him do. They took intentional action. This is a pattern that gets repeated. Peter one night is in the middle of the boat, in the middle of the disciples, in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the night. They see what they think is a ghost, and Peter cries out, God, if it's really you, Lord, then tell me to come to you on the water. And he says, come. And in response to Jesus' invitation, Peter gets out of the boat. Implication was, if you are who you say you are, then I no longer want to be where I am. He took intentional action. The disciples encountered the same thing with the feeding of the 5,000. The reason we know this story is because they came up to Jesus and said, hey, look, think you should send the people home. Like, no way we can feed all these folks. And he says, bring me what you have. They bring 5 loaves and 2 fish. You know the story. Jesus blesses it. He breaks it, tells them to pass it out. They give some intentional action in response to what Jesus had told them to do. And we're still talking about it. In other words, it wasn't enough for them to encounter Jesus as they were, where they were, in response to who he was and what he had said. They took an intentional next step in his direction. Now listen, I don't have to tell you, like, we're different people, different personalities, different ideologies. And so my next step may not look like your next step. We could respond to this in a million different ways. Like if you're not a follower of Jesus and you're just here because, somebody drug you in or she was really pretty and she said, hey, why don't you come to church with me? And you're thinking, okay, here I am. If you're not a follower of Jesus, look, a very intentional next step for you might be just to come back next week. If you are a follower of Jesus, but you've never been baptized, maybe an intentional next step for you is, hey, I'm gonna let the world know that Jesus is Lord. Maybe, I don't know if you've ever struggled with this, maybe you would sit in church on a day like today and you say, you know what, man, I'm gonna read my Bible more. I'm gonna read my Bible more. But you wake up on Monday and it just doesn't happen. But an intentional next step for you might be to set the alarm, to get up in the morning, to open your Bible, spend some time reading your Bible and praying before you go off to the madness that is work. Maybe your next step would be to stop at the table on the way out today and say, hey, count me in for serving. I want to get synced up here. I want to give my life to something that God's a part of. Maybe it's to lean into generosity and begin to give financially towards the purposes of God. Maybe it's making a phone call or sending a text to mend a relationship. The point being, don't settle for an experience of singing songs and encountering God without responding with some intentional action in his direction. And maybe let me ease your mind a bit. I'm talking about your next step. Not your next 15 steps, not even your next 5 steps. You don't have to figure that out yet. What is your next step in his direction? As you think about that, you got to keep this next thing in mind. And the E in our acrostic is this: expect opposition. Expect opposition. Now, this is where we get tripped up because many of us grew up in the church youth group environment. You went to summer camp, you got real jazzed up. By Thursday night, everybody was holding hands and singing around the fire. We put a stick in the fire and said, man, from now on, God, I promise you, I am gonna live for you every single day. I'm gonna tell everybody in my high school about you. I remember this is a side note, but if you'll let me tell a story. I was a youth pastor for a long time, and we took some kids to church camp, and they got real fired up about living for Jesus. And so when school started again, I went to have lunch with some of the kids, and I saw all these pictures on lockers. It was like a homemade invitation where somebody was inviting people to our Wednesday night thing at church, but they put the Zigzag Man on the, do you guys not know who the Zigzag Man is? So teenagers told me about this, but if you roll your own tobacco, you might use a particular kind of paper that's made by a company called Zigzag, and they have a man that looks like Jesus that is like the front face of their company. I can't believe you guys are so spiritual. So I'm walking down the hall and I see all these pictures of the Zigzag guy and like, hey, come join us on Wednesday nights at 6:30. And I was like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? That's the Zigzag Man. But they were just pumped about living for Jesus. It's like, we're gonna do this. We grew up in that environment, and we had all the intention to start where we were, to take a next step. But the thing that got us was the opposition. And it's not always your fault. Like, I think people who do what I do, we're notorious for peddling this message that if you follow Jesus, everything will go well for you. Your bank account will get bigger. Your health will get better. Your abs will be sleeker and sexier than ever before. It's pretty much like all the best cards from the community chess pile of Monopoly, a bank error in your favor, unexpected tax return, an inheritance. Sometimes you even score a get out of jail free card. So there's that side of the fence that goes, man, the good is coming, and the bad, there's another side, and the bad is gonna decrease in decreasing measure, like all the things we don't want in life, trials, temptation, tribulation, trouble, all that stuff's gonna go away. And listen, it sounds fantastic. It really does. There have been times when I've been up late at night like you, and I've been tempted to call the number on the screen and sow a seed of faith and go like, man, I want that kind of prize too. It sounds amazing. The problem is, it just isn't true. In fact, Jesus said as much. as early as when these fishermen and this tax collector started to follow him. Matthew tells us about a time when Jesus pulled them together and he said, guys, I'm going to send you out to do the things that you've seen me doing. And you can imagine, I mean, this was game day. They were pumped. And so Jesus is giving this pre-game talk, and it's rocking until Jesus gets to this part. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. I think they're with him. And then he says this, be on your guard. You'll be handed over to local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, don't worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you'll be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. I imagine they were thinking, hold the phone for just a second. Handed over, flogged, arrested. Like, how come you didn't tell us about any of this when we were counting the fish that day? Listen, Jesus said things like this over and over again in the Gospels. It's quite disturbing. In fact, when these guys got to the end of their journey with Jesus and Jesus began to explain how this was going to go down, handed over, crucified, to be killed, and they're left figuring out like, okay, well, this is obviously not the king that we expected. He's obviously not going to bring about the kind of kingdom, the power that we were expecting. And as they're contemplating, like, what do we do with this? Do we follow him anyway? Jesus said these words to them very plainly. He said, I've told you these things so that in me you'll have peace. It's like, well, hold on, time out. Peace? Did you hear what you just said? He said, oh yeah, no. In this world, you'll have trouble. But take heart. I've overcome the world. In this world, you will have trouble. We want to interpret that metaphorically. But the thing that bothers us is not that it happened the way that Jesus said it would, but that it happens. And when it does, we're tempted to throw in the towel and call it quits because after all, why would a good God, and we all fill in that blank, or we resign to the fact that maybe we did something horribly wrong somewhere along the way and God is trying to punish us. Like it's sort of like a spiritual timeout. So hear me out. Following Jesus is amazing, but sometimes it's hard. It is. And when you decide to take an intentional next step in his direction, when you decide, you know what, I'm going to put him first in my family, in my finances, I'm going to put him first in our marriage and in my career, I'm putting him first. Jesus says, troubles and trials, you got to remember, they're not the exception. They're to be expected. They are an expectation. I say that because if you don't hear that in advance, when things get hard, you will not heed Jesus' words and take heart. You know what you'll take? You'll take the next exit. You'll look for a U-turn to try to get back to that thing you did, the life you lived before you began to follow Jesus. But if you know that what Jesus said is true, that in this world we will have trouble, in this world, even as Jesus is in the center of our life, then we won't take an exit. We'll just take notice. And that'll set us up to do this next thing. The P in our acrostic is persevere. Persevere. Jesus used these synonyms. He used the words abide or remain. Here's what he said to his disciples. In John 15, he said, remain in me, and I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Are you seeing it? Remain over and over and over again. I love that he points out that a branch cannot bear fruit by itself. It gives us a word picture because what happens to a branch when it disconnects from the vine and tries to bear fruit by itself? not only does it not bear fruit, but what happens to it? It dies. And that word picture that was very literal in their world, come on, isn't that the thing that we sometimes feel in a spiritual sense in ours? When we charge the gates with a plan, but our plan is met with a problem, and sometimes it's the stuff we didn't expect. Sometimes those problems are the things that we couldn't avoid, but sometimes, in fact, I think a lot of times, it's self-inflicted wounds. It's the stuff that we did, that we're doing, that we can't believe we did again. We never look at it in terms of, I'm disconnecting from the vine. No, that's too simple. We just say, well, you know what? It's just this one thing just for now. It's just a temporary deviation. It's just this one business deal. It's just this one relationship. It's just a season in my life. But when we disconnect, that lack of connection, it has a way of eroding away any sense of perseverance in us. And give it time, and you'll start to convince yourself, God must not be happy with me. God must not want anything to do with me, when perhaps nothing could be further from the truth. Listen, we're not Jesus. So we're not going to get it all right all the time. There are times when not only are we going to fall short of God's expectation of us, we're going to fall short of our own expectation for ourselves. And so something that I've tried to remind myself of over the last few years, knowing that at times I'm not gonna meet all my goals when it comes to diet and exercise. I'm not gonna meet my goals when it comes to relationships and finances. A phrase that I've utilized in my life is this phrase right here: fail forward. Fail forward. It's the thing I do to try to encourage myself to keep on keeping on. Will I fail? Of course I'll fail. But this is my effort to make sure that failure doesn't have the last word. That when I fail, I'm gonna get up and I'm gonna keep moving in the direction that I wanna move. When I fail in my relationship with God, I'm not gonna allow that to turn me around, to go the other way. I'm gonna get up and I'm gonna keep walking towards Him instead of retreating away from Him. Now, don't laugh at me. I'm embarrassed to tell you that for a season in my life, I thought I was so brilliant that I actually invented this phrase. Right? Solomon reminds us, nothing new under the sun. I told my neighbors about this. We talk about following Jesus. I say, hey, you're gonna fail forward. Talk to our staff about this. I convince myself of this all the time. So you can imagine my dismay when I learned that leadership guru John Maxwell actually wrote a book by this very title in the year 2000. I'm not angry about it, but I'm gonna ruin it for you. So I'm just gonna save you the $16.95 for the book. Here's what he says. John Maxwell says in his book that everything that we really want in this life, it's all uphill. And so when we walk uphill, because we're doing something that's hard, we're gonna face challenges, we're gonna face failure. And so he enacts this 4-step process to fail forward. He said the step number 1 is testing. This is that we decide we're gonna do something that we've never really done before. Just like when you stand at the altar and you promise your life and forever to someone in a marriage when you've never been married before. It's like, I hope so, like, let's go. Or parenting, or when you decide that you're gonna get serious about your relationship with God. So there's this testing phase. I'm doing something I've never done before. The second phase, he says, is failing. Like, because you've never done it before, you're not gonna get it all right all the time. Well, that's where most people stop. But he says step 3 is important because step 3 is learning. Chick-fil-A founder Truett Cathy says, failure is the price we pay for progress. John Maxwell in his book said, when you're learning, like when you're down in the valley of this uphill climb, he said, never make decisions in the valley. When you're in the valley, just learn the lesson. Don't make decisions. Make decisions on the mountain, because in the valley, your mistakes and your failures, that's all you can see. So if you make a decision there, it won't be a good decision. So you learn, and then it sets you up for this last thing. Re-entering. Like you get up, you dust yourself off, and you take your next step towards the goal, towards the prize, towards Jesus. If you think of it in terms of Apple Maps, when we deviate from the destination that we've plugged in, sometimes because we think, well, we know better, we hear the little voice say, proceed to the route. Proceed to the route. If you watch Disney films, it's Dory and Finding Nemo saying, just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. What do? We swim. Jesus said it like this: remain in me, and I will also remain in you. So start where you are, but don't stay where you are. Take intentional action. Expect opposition and persevere. Failure is not going to be an exception to your journey, but when it comes, don't let it be final either. So I want to leave you with this. In light of all of that, let me ask you, what's your next step? Like, what's the next logical step that you can take towards Jesus? I told you a while ago, we're different, so it's going to be different for each and every one of us. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to discover what it is. In just a second, I'm going to close by praying for us. And after I pray, I want you to just continue for just a minute with your head bowed and your eyes closed. And I want you to ask God, what's my next step? Because here's the beautiful thing about a relationship with Jesus is that we don't just give the opportunity to speak to him, but we believe by his Spirit he speaks to us. So I want you to sit in just a few seconds of silence and ask the question, God, what's my next step? And if he responds, you feel that nudge, that thing come up again that you always try to suppress or go, man, maybe that's not it. If you're really serious, I would encourage you, use the Connect card that you got on the way in and write it down. And then if you want to do something really, really bold, before you leave here today or as you leave here today, tell someone else what it is and see what God does. Don't settle. Don't settle for coming and singing and praying and listening. Connect with a plan. Take a next step in his direction. You'll be glad you did. God, we thank you that you never give up on us. And we were just singing that earlier and just how powerful that is. God, we thank you that by your Spirit, you continue to speak to us. That you don't leave us to ourselves to live our lives settling for lesser things. So God, in this moment, we invite you to speak. We just want to listen.
Make me a vessel of your peace, where there is war, let fighting cease. All that divides us, come reconcile us. Make me a vessel of your peace. Make me a vessel of your love. Where there is hatred, break it up. All creeds and colors bind us together. Make me a vessel of join us as we sing? Let's make this our prayer today. All for His glory. Make me a vessel of your own, where dreams are dead, come wake them up. A new horizon, I feel it rising. Make me a vessel of your own, and pour me out, pour me out, come pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go, pour me out. I'm yours, pour me out, come pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go. Pour me out, your glory. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing, oh, let it flow, oh, let it flow, to my heart, to my world. Pour me out, pour me out, pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go, pour me out. I'm yours, pour me out, pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go, pour me out, come pour me out, come pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go, pour me out. I'm yours, pour me out, come pour me out. Wherever I am, wherever I go. River, let mercy flow through my heart to my world. Like a rushing river, let mercy flow through my heart to my world.
Hey, if there's a way that we could pray for you, if taking a next step just seems kind of ambiguous and you kind of lack clarity with that, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes when we're done today. I'll be right here. I'll be glad to talk with you, pray with you. Some of our prayer team, some of our staff might be available as well. We'd love the opportunity to do that. But if that's not practical, if you think I got to get on, I can't stick around, then I'd invite you to take advantage of the prayer card located on the Connect card. You can just give us enough information, as little or as much as you want, so that we can have some context for the conversation. If it's a prayer request, if it's a conversation you want to have, then give us a way to follow up with you. You can drop it off in the black boxes or at Connection Point, and we'd be glad to follow up from there. I'm going to invite you guys to have a seat. for just a minute. I want to tell you about some crazy, crazy fun and exciting things going on in our church, and then I'm going to get you out of here. So, reminder, next Sunday is going to look a little bit different, and it's even going to smell a little bit different next week because we're having a birthday party. Now, I mentioned our church officially turned 12 this month, and so it's like, well, why didn't you have a birthday party on the day you turned 12? Well, if you have more than one kid, you understand how this works. Like one kid, it's always on the day. More than one kid, it's like, we'll try to get it within a 6-week time frame. So we now have 1,000 of you guys who are gathering with us. And so next Sunday, man, we're going to celebrate, and we're going to do it with some of the things that we just absolutely love. We're going to have baptisms. You're going to get to hear some baptism stories. There are 2 incredible, incredible testimony stories. This is like if you grew up in going to church, we used to have testimony time, testimony services. This is the equivalent of that, the modern day equivalent. We got the testimonies on video. So you're going to get to hear what God is doing in the lives of the men and the women who are attending Alamo Community Church. We're going to sing some songs. We're going to celebrate communion together. And then a party wouldn't be complete without food. So we have 1,500 hamburgers that we're grilling. They'll be out on the porch. Yeah, you clap for that. There it is. Okay. All right, I'm with you. So those are going to be on the porch when you leave next week. You can plan to stick around the first service, folks. We're going to kind of go, oh, thank you for coming. Take yours to go. But you guys get to stay, hang out on the grass, meet some of the people that you met last week. Then the following week on October 9th, that's when we're going to move from 1 service to 3. Now, we talked about this a few weeks ago in terms of, man, having the opportunity to add on to this building. We are out of kids' space, so we're going to add on 12,500 square feet. We'll tell you more about that in the days ahead, but we had some pretty pictures to show you. It's going to be along this side and up, and while we wait to build room, we know we need to make room, and so on October 9th, we're going to move to 3 services. So the new service times will be 8:30, 10, and 11:30. 8:30, 10, and 11:30. I told the 9 o'clock folks that they could just set their alarm for 30 minutes earlier and come at 8:30. And because you guys sometimes, maybe, I'm just guessing, maybe you sleep in a little longer on Sunday, why don't you give yourself an extra 30 minutes and you could come at 11:30, and then we'll create a brand new open room at 10 o'clock. Hey, this week, seriously, we're going to put some stuff in your email inbox to help you decide what service you want to attend, and just to let us know how we can prepare and respond to that. So 8:30, 10, 11:30, that's on October 9th. Not next Sunday. Next Sunday we're partying. October 9th, we're splitting the party up into 3 parties, all right? So do that. Last thing is this. For the past several weeks, we've been talking about this mission of our church and those values of connecting with purpose and connecting with people and connecting with a plan. And I just want you to know that the end result of that is not about Alamo Community Church. The end result of a God-given mission and vision is God. And so we celebrate when God shows up and he does something in an incredible way for the kingdom's sake. And if you've been around here for a while, you know that about a year ago, we had an opportunity to send out 2 members of our staff, our associate pastor, Ryan Proudfoot, our community group pastor at the time, Izzy Mendez, because they felt called by God to go and start ACC downtown. And they've been doing it. I'm telling you, God's doing amazing things there. They baptized folks last Sunday, baptized 5 people. I told him, send me all the pictures. I want to see it. It's amazing. Yeah, that's so cool. But about that same time frame, Caleb Sines, Caleb, our worship pastor, he and I started talking because he said, man, I think God might be doing something similar in my life. And my first conversation with him is I just said, hey, man, don't be afraid of that. Lean into it. And so we've been praying about it. We've been talking about it. Our elder team has talked about this and tried to discern God's will in it. Caleb has linked up with a couple of church planting networks here in our city to do all the stuff that you do when you're getting ready to plant a church. You have assessments and resource collection, trying to figure out how we go about doing this. And I'm excited to tell you that in the summer of 23, Caleb and Jen are going to be stepping out from among us to go and plant the Garden Church in the medical center right here in San Antonio. I say I'm excited, not because I'm excited for them to leave. We love them, and their fingerprints will be on Alamo Community Church for a long, long time to come. But I'm excited because they're doing this thing that we talked about today. They have heard God speak, and in response to their invitation, to his invitation, they're taking a next step. And so Jen and Caleb, along with Leland and Abby, I'm going to ask them to come up on the stage today. And I want to close today by just praying over them. I mentioned they're starting the Garden Church, and here's a couple of things I want to say to you about that. If you live in the medical center area, or you have some friends who live in the med center area, or you've been coming to ACC for a while and you miss the days when we would set up and take down in the hotel and you think, man, I'd really like to do that. Well, then stop by the table on the way out, because Caleb and Jen are going to be there. They have some booklets and some information they'd be glad to let you look through to answer questions. They're going to begin to have some informational meetings, and I would invite you, if you feel God stirring in your heart to be a part of that, I would invite you to go to those meetings and be a part of that. Like I said, this isn't about like us building the kingdom of Alamo Community Church. This is just God using us as a spoke in the wheel to what he's doing in this world. And so we're excited to do that. So Caleb and Jen and Abby and Leland, man, I am super excited for you. Leland and I shared a donut earlier. I'm going to ask Ben Buller, who's a part of our elder team, who's been a part of these discussions, to come up and join us in praying. And I'm going to invite you to stand. And this is going to be our benediction today as we close. We just want to pray God's blessing and his favor over Caleb and Jen, Leland and Abby, and their core team, and what God has for the future. God, we stand in awe of who you are and what you've done. Man, who are we that you would include us and what you're up to in this world? And God, I praise you for what you've spoken to Caleb and Jen and to their family, for what you've called them to in this next season of their life. And God, I can only imagine, even from where we stand now, the stories that you're going to write of transformation, of change, the sense of this togetherness, a community that you're going to stir in the hearts of the people in the Med Center area. God, I pray that you would fan the flame of your favor and your blessing upon their life, upon this calling, upon those who are going to rally around them, and upon us as a church as we come alongside them as well. God, we thank you. We thank you for speaking, for using us, for allowing us to be a part of your kingdom. And we pray your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it's in the name of our King we pray it. Amen. Thank you for being here. God bless you as you live.
When we cry for freedom.